been saying I want to introduce the spiritual psychology of the Kabbalah. I won't be getting into the details of it because what I want to do now is create a series that we will put up on YouTube, we will put up on my podcast. For anybody who wants an introduction to the Kabbalah and the spiritual psychology of the Kabbalah, we'll have an easy place to get it. So first of all, here's what I'm not going to be doing. For any of those of you who are engaged in what's called the counting of the Omer, the counting of the Omer began, the 49 days of the Omer began on at the second Seder, which means the day after the first day of Passover. It goes on for 49 days and concludes at the holiday of Shavuot. So here's what's typically done. People find an image that looks something like this. And we have here the 7 bottom sfirot, all the way from Chesed to Gevura, all the way down. For those who are just listening, you can go to any image that says the Kabbalistic tree of life. You'll notice that there are 7 lower sfirot. And then what happens is you'll find some kind of a chart that we have, that we put a link to in our Shabbat email. And the chart tells you how to count each day of the period called the counting of the Omer. So it starts on Chesed, goes over to Gevura, and all the way down. That is the way one conducts the practice. Unfortunately, from my perspective, probably 10 or so years ago, I had to admit to myself, it doesn't feel organically like the right way to do Kabbalistic spiritual psychology. I'll say why in a moment. I've created my own method that feels more organic to the Sephirotic system, the system of Kabbalistic emanations. I don't recommend not to do this. It's a great way to study the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah. But in these talks, I want to give an introduction of what all this is. And then in my classes, I'll be teaching about how to do spiritual psychology of Kabbalah and ultimately load those up into talks as well. So first of all, what is the Kabbalah? What is the Kabbalah and where did it come from? So the best book to read on that, the most simple book for the intelligent layperson, is Gershom Scholem's book called The Kabbalah. Okay? The Kabbalah by Gershom Scholem. It's a collection of his 1974, it's published in 1974. It is a collection of his articles from Encyclopedia Judaica, organized very well. So if you want a 1-volume treatment of the Kabbalah, its history, its concepts, and many, many different topics, this is the best book to read, Kabbalah by Gershom Scholem. Others of his introductory books are actually, I think, too dense for the non-expert. I will be putting up a bibliography on my website. Now, I want to read to you one passage from the introductory part of the book. This is on page 42, which I think is one of the most important passages to read if you are going to study what the Kabbalah is. He says the following. Sorry, I think it's on page 45, page 45. He says, the encounter between the Gnostic tradition, of which I will explain in a moment, contained in the book Bahir, which I have right here, which I'll be discussing in just a moment. The encounter between the Gnostic tradition contained in the Bahir and the Neoplatonic ideas concerning God, God's emanation, man's place in the world, was extremely fruitful, leading to the deep penetration of these ideas into earlier mystical theories. And here's the main sentence. The Kabbalah, in its historical significance, can be defined as the product of the interpenetration of Jewish Gnosticism and Jewish Neoplatonism. Therefore, if you want to understand what the Kabbalah is, by the admitted greatest scholar of the Kabbalah, Gershom Scholem, who died, if I'm not mistaken, in 1987, all study of Kabbalah comes down from Scholem to his doctoral students and their doctoral students. There would be no modern study of the Kabbalah without Gershom Scholem. I've benefited greatly from him and his students. I don't consider myself a university-level Kabbalah scholar, although I've read the scholarship. And we would not have this, I think, without the extraordinary leadership of Gershom Scholem. So Gershom Scholem says Kabbalah is the intersection between Jewish Neoplatonism and Jewish Gnosticism. Therefore, to understand the Kabbalah, you have to understand Gnosticism and Neoplatonism. In fact, that's the first thing I would recommend you ask when you read any book on the Kabbalah, any teacher of the Kabbalah. One thing to ask is the person explaining Gnosticism in general, Jewish Gnosticism in particular, and Neoplatonism in general, and Jewish Neoplatonism in particular? If they're not doing that, I'm not saying they're not teaching Kabbalah well. They're not following the advice of the modern Rabbi of the Kabbalah, Gershom Scholem, that's what the Kabbalah is the interpenetration of Jewish Gnosticism and Jewish Neoplatonism. So to understand those things, because I wanted to teach the Kabbalah well, I've had a more or less lifetime study of Neoplatonism and Gnosticism. Here's a very good book by many articles edited by Richard Wallace, just one of many. But if you really want to study the Kabbalah, you should go out and read even a Wikipedia article. The Wikipedia articles, I vetted them, they're pretty good, on Gnosticism, on Neoplatonism. You can go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's online. Any source you can find, study Neoplatonism and Gnosticism to prepare yourself for the study of Kabbalah if you want to do it correctly. So if you want to get out your chart and just read over the 7 Sefirot, it's a time-honored tradition. There's nothing bad about it. There's a lot of good with it. But if you really want to get into a deep understanding of the Kabbalah and therefore the spiritual psychology of the Kabbalah, ground yourself a bit in Neoplatonism and Gnosticism. So I'll explain those just a little bit. To understand Jewish Gnosticism, Gnosticism and Neoplatonism in general, you'll have to look at a book like the one I've shown, not necessarily that one, but a book like that. And here's what you'll discover. Gnosticism is an ancient system, and we receive this system from many texts that were written in what are called the intertestamental period. Let's say if we see that the Hebrew Bible is somewhat formed by around 400 BCE, again, not fully formed. There are many texts that are still being edited and still included in the Bible. One reason that we know that it was formed by the late end of the millennium is that the Dead Sea Scrolls that seem to have been organized around 100, 200 BCE, they have most of the text, what we call the Hebrew Bible. So the Hebrew Bible is coming together in the late Second Temple period. So as the Hebrew Bible is coming together, there are many texts that claim to be written by characters in the Hebrew Bible or inspired by the Hebrew Bible. Okay? So some of these texts were put in what is called the Apocrypha, which you'll find in every Catholic Bible. But there are even texts that are so wild, so way out, that they're not even included in the Apocrypha. And those texts were included in, I'll bring one volume up here. You'll excuse me for the show and tell, but I want to give you the full treatment in text called the Pseudo Epigrapha. Okay, you'll see, right? The Old Testament Pseudo Epigrapha. Let's put it on this camera right here. Okay, this one right here, okay? Old Testament Pseudo Epigrapha. I'll put this on the a bibliography on my website. Pseudo Epigrapha is an epigrapha, a book. Pseudo meaning the author is not who the author says it is. So you'll have the Book of Abraham. You'll have the Second Book of Solomon. That goes by many, many different names. Pseudo Epigrapha because the authors are not being clear who they are. They're using a character in the Hebrew Bible because they want people to read it. They want to claim to be in the tradition of a character of the Bible. Now, these are editions that are edited by a man named Charles Worth, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, James Charles Worth. 2 volumes. I don't recommend trying to get through them. It'll take you the rest of your natural life to get through these 2 books. But know that they are there. So one way that we gain access to ancient Gnosticism and ancient Neoplatonism is to look in the Pseudo Epigrapha, which are collections of books that were written in the intertestamental period, many of which, or most of which, have Gnostic and Neoplatonic themes. Okay, that's how we know what ancient Neoplatonism and ancient Gnosticism is. Now, conveniently, an author took these ancient texts, and they're quite extraordinary, and collected them into a book called the Gnostic Bible. So somebody's gone through those two great volumes that I just showed you and collected them to a book called the Gnostic Bible. The Gnostic Bible is edited by Barnstone and Willis Barnstone and Marvin Mayer, published in '03. Now, you might be able to find an inexpensive version of this online. If you can get it from the library, I take it from the library. It's not a book you should be lugging around for the rest of your life, as I might be. But if you want to get a sense, what do we mean by ancient Gnosticism? What do we mean by ancient Neoplatonism? There are books out there in English. Scholars have discovered the originals of these books. They are in Coptic Greek. They're in different levels of Coptic language. They are in different levels of Greek. They're in Aramaic. Some are in Hebrew. Some are in Latin. It's a whole variety of language, which is why it's taken teams of scholars generations after they discovered these books in monasteries in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and even 20th centuries. Of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls is part of this, discovered in a cave in the Judean desert. The Gnostic Gospels are part of this, discovered hidden in Egypt in 1945. So just to look at the history of how we have recovered these texts is an incredible history. But eventually, different linguistic experts, those who knew Coptic, those who know different levels of Greek, those who knew Latin, different levels of Aramaic, they put competent scholars in each of the translations and then combined them. It's an astonishing exercise in modern scholarship to get these texts together. So how do we know what ancient Neoplaton was? How do we know what ancient Gnosticism was? We've discovered that we, meaning the Western scholarly community, have discovered these texts or rediscovered these texts, starting mostly in the 1700s, but others actually never went out. They were just hidden because they were heretical texts. And there was a time when you studied or taught a heretical text, you could be banished, you could be executed. So these were part of the Western heretical tradition. And when you have the beginnings of the modern society, they are now accepted as scholarly study. There are groups, for example, the Theosophical Society, a branch of which we have here in Los Angeles, that study these texts as their text. So while the rest of us are studying exoteric texts, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, etc., the Talmud, St. Augustine, there's a whole set of which you might call publicly available texts. Let's say in the Jewish and Christian tradition, there's a whole set of texts that are called the esoteric hidden texts. Not hidden texts so much because anybody can get a copy if they want. Sometimes the official text, for example, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, again, the Christian fathers, the Talmud, etc. These are called texts that have theology, meaning instruction about the relatively accepted understandings of God. And sometimes these other texts, including Kabbalistic texts, are called theosophy. Theology just means the logos of theos, the teaching about God. Theosophy means the wisdom of theos, theosophia. They're just made up words, but one refers to the commonly accessible texts, we'll call the exoteric texts, the texts that are not mysterious, versus the esoteric texts, the so-called hidden texts that are actually no longer hidden. So sometimes if you find yourself in a religious environment, not sure what's going on, you say, are they studying theosophy, which means ideas about the divine that come from these kinds of texts over here? Or are they discussing theology, ideas about God that come from more traditional texts? So in the 20th century, you have the opening up of what are called theosophic traditions. Kabbalah is a theosophic tradition. Kabbalah is theosophy. Why is it theosophy? Because Kabbalistic ideas do not come from the Hebrew Bible. They might claim to, but they don't. Kabbalistic ideas do not come from the Talmud. They don't come from the Midrash. They don't come from any official exoteric Jewish texts that are, as it were, to use a term from today applied to ancient times, they're not from the public domain. These texts were hidden. They weren't distributed. You couldn't study them without passing through some kind of review, some kind of a committee that made sure that you were qualified. You may have heard you couldn't study Kabbalah until you were 40. There probably wasn't an age limit, but there was probably a sense that you had to be vetted by Kabbalistic scholars before you could start to study the Kabbalah, the Zohar, etc. So we have this ancient body of texts that were more or less hidden, preserved by secret circles, esoteric circles. All this comes into open view in the 17, 18, and 1900s. All right, so that's a little historical review of the world of hidden text, the so-called esoteric text. Their ideas about the divine and related matters were called theosophy. Kabbalah is right in there. It's a hidden text, the Zohar. Its ideas about the divine are not standard text theology. They're called theosophic ideas about God. So part of what is Kabbalah? It is Jewish theosophy. It's a set of Jewish esoteric hidden text rooted in ancient Gnosticism and Platonism. Now, why am I pushing this vocabulary? Hopefully you'll hear this a couple of times. If you don't have this vocabulary reasonably mastered, you don't understand Kabbalah. And I'm sorry to set such a high bar, but if you say, I study Kabbalah, therefore I know what Gnosticism is, briefly. I know what Neoplatonism is, briefly. I know the distinction between the exoteric Western tradition, let's say the Bible, Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and other texts. And I know that what are called the esoteric texts, meaning some of the texts that I've listed over here. That's the minimum you have to know in order to study the Kabbalah according to the standard that Gershom Scholem has set out, which means we're going to try to study it with our intellectual lights on, so you know what it is you are studying. You can locate it on the intellectual map of Western thought. Okay, that's part one of what I want to talk about today. I'll take all questions toward the end. The next question is, what is Gnosticism? Very briefly. What is Platonism, Neoplaton? Very briefly. And what does this have to do with human spiritual psychology? What does this have to do with the inner life of a human being? So let's start here. Let's assume that that any belief that a person has about how things are, it has to resonate as meaning. For example, I can tell you from the outside, from my studies in graduate school, I can explain Marxism to you. And when I studied it, I realized it's a theory. It's just not true. I mean, there are some things you think and you read it and you say to yourself, well, it's a theory, but it's not connected to reality. Which is one reason why you've heard me say many times, so-called critical race theory, which is a version of Marxism. I've read it. I've studied it. I do not consider it a valid theory. I mean, it's presented as a theory. I don't believe the theory is connected to reality, and therefore it doesn't speak to me at an inner level. However, even when I understand Marxism, I understand what the problem was that brought Marxism into development, and that was the worse and worse inequities created by what we're going to call the Industrial Revolution. So during the Industrial Revolution, people were moved from the villages into the cities. They worked for great industry. The conditions were deplorable. A huge amount of wealth was amassed into too few people. So Marx had to figure this out and figure out a solution. I personally don't think he understood the problem. His solution was in no means any kind of a solution that is bearable, but I understood it. I understood enough to know why people believed it. Same thing with critical race theory. I don't believe that the theory is true, but I understand why some people want to believe it is true. So there are some things that we study and we say, that's pretty close to my belief. There are other things that we study where you say to yourself, well, that's not my belief, but I understand why other people believe it. So when I discuss Gnosticism, like discussing the religion of another person, I can teach. I think I'm a pretty good teacher of Christianity. I'm a pretty good teacher of Islam. Again, they are not my religious systems, but I can teach them with great understanding of the religious system and why it grabs the hearts of so many millions of people. So I'm going to describe Gnosticism and then Neoplatonism. Again, not that I believe them, but that I understand why people do, and I understand how it can speak to a part of my own spirituality and religiosity. So Gnosticism holds that in the pre-time of the creation of the world, which many Gnostic authors, by the way, point at the early chapters of Genesis as giving us tiny, tiny little hints, that then got filled out into lengthy, lengthy books. For example, the books of Enoch and many others take meager lines from the Hebrew Bible and out of them create entire realities. What's the idea? The idea of the Gnostic idea, which is rooted, by the way, in Platonism, has the idea that there is some kind of divine force that brings the world into being. This divine force also emanates what you might call the ideas, the realm of ideas that ought to govern our lives. I like to talk about the Platonic ideas of love, justice, truth, beauty, the good, etc. And somehow they emanate into the human being. And if we live according to them, we can create in our lives love, justice, truth, and beauty, the good, and the holy, and ideally live our lives well. Well, if you look at Plato's metaphor of the cave, which, if I'm not mistaken, occurs at the end of his Republic, you have a whole different image than the one of the ideas, the world of the forms that percolate down into human consciousness. The idea of the cave has something else, and the Platonic idea of the cave, you should look this up, gives us a great introduction to Gnostic thought. So here's another image of the human being. We're not the beneficiaries of the flow from the higher realms into our realms in something of an uninterrupted way to any person who is open to them. We have a different image that we are stuck in a prison. By the way, the movie The Matrix captures the Gnostic idea very well. So what is this prison? We are in a cave, and we are chained watching a wall of the cave. Now, on the wall of the cave are images dancing around. And we think the images that we see are real. That's all we can see. So everything we see are these dancing images on the wall, and we're trying to interpret the images. We're trying to make sense of the images. That's all we have is our perception of the images. Now, in the theory, a person breaks the chains and sees that behind the people are others dancing with images. Behind them is a fire. Therefore, the shadows on the wall are created by people who are dancing crazy dances with the images, and they are creating the images on the wall. So it's the people dancing with the crazy images and the fire that are creating the images. What we are taking as real is actually a deception. But we are so entranced by it that we spend all our time trying to figure out these crazy images and this crazy dance when it is actually not real. It's produced by the so-called beings with the images, the fire behind it, projecting it onto the wall. That's the human condition from the Gnostic point of view. We live in a world that not only do we not understand it, we can't understand it because it is not understandable. It's entirely contrived. We don't know that we're chained inside the cave. So what does this, as it were, enlightened person do? They break the chains. They see the true nature of things, horrified by it. They climb out of the cave into the sun. And now the person sees the real light. They're, as it were, enlightened. Now their job is to go back down the stairs and help other people break their chains, turn around, see these crazy images. They have nothing to do with reality. The reality is up the stairs where you can go out and see the sun and the world. So they break that. They break the grip of these people trying to keep them inside the cave. They understand that the fire down there is only to deceive them, and they break out and they go into the sunlight. So who's the Gnostic? From the Greek word gnosis with a G, is the knower. The knower is the one who knows that this world that we live in is a distorted world, is a fake world. It's a world that's only there to mesmerize us and entrance us in a false reality. Now, by the way, these are myths. When I read the Gnostic myths in the books I just showed you, they're filled with different versions of Gnostic myths, some of them quite horrible, meaning these beings that are doing this, they're disgusting God types that want to inflict great misery and damage upon us human beings. They're pretty awful. In fact, when I was teaching this material to my Origins of Jewish Mysticism class many years ago at the AJR, And I brought in some of these texts. The students were horrified of just how disgusting and vile these texts were. Well, who wrote these texts? These people were writing these texts during the descent of humanity during different times in the Roman Empire, where people feel that everything was falling apart. Those who were in power were decadent people. How they plundered working people, marauding bands of thieves and bandits and brigands. That was the world they live in, and they knew this world can't be the real world. I think of when ISIS burst out of Syria and went into Iraq and just murdered thousands and thousands and thousands of people. I think of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. I think of living in the Soviet Union under Mao's China, being a victim of the Imperial Japan. They brought just a version of reality that is horrible beyond imagination. The Nazis, the Soviets, Chinese communists, Imperial Japan. As far as numbers go, and then you go down a little, again, atrocious, but as far as numbers go, you look at the depredations of ISIS, of the Taliban in Afghanistan, the Rwandan massacre. You look around the world and you see when reality, as it were, just turns on people, and the people in charge have these ideas that just license murder and license depredation. And we know for sure there's another way to be. We know that the world ought to be governed by love, justice, truth, and beauty, and fairness, and human rights and human dignity. And then we see regimes come into the world that just bulldoze over those realities, and by the way, and always, this is the some of the worst versions of the ideological systems. If you've read the Gulag Archipelago and others, not only were they bulldozing over human beings, but they put up a belief system they wanted people to believe. So if you've read anything about the culture during Mao, during Stalin, Nazism, it's not that just they were brutal tyrants. They were brutal tyrants that wanted to take over the thought system. And as far as we can know, many people bought into the thought system. And there's always the person on the side that said, they have control over my life. I refuse to believe. I refuse to believe that what they're teaching is ultimate reality. That person is the Gnostic. They are the knower. Now, what they know is not known by anybody that they know, or if somebody else knows it, they're being pretty quiet about it. But they know it's not true. No matter how many someone tells them about Stalinism or Maoism or Nazism, they say, yeah, to get along. But in their heart of hearts, they're tuning into the BBC, or they're tuning into the true God. So Gnosticism, going back to the ancient version, has a sense that that evil gods who rebelled against the true God created their own a divider, like a vault between the higher realm and the lower realm. They are lesser gods. We can't get through to the higher gods, and these lesser gods are ruling our realm with great evil intent. So when you live under the lesser gods, the temptation is just to believe what they say, because they are our gods, although from a cosmic perspective, they are lesser gods. And then there's the Gnostic, then there's the knower that says, I know these aren't the real gods. I know that the world they're creating down here is not a real world that the true God would create. I'm stuck down here. As George Santayana said, I'm a resident of this world, but a citizen of another world. That is the idea of the Gnostic. So Kabbalah has a strongly Gnostic dimension. By the way, if you want to then see Jewish Neoplatonism Gnosticism, here's another book that I recommend. Hold on a second. The Origins of Jewish Mysticism by Peter Schaeffer. The Origins of Jewish Mysticism by Peter Schaeffer. And it's he gives, it's a very short book compared to these, but he gives an introduction and then descriptions of of a selection of Jewish texts that give you this Gnostic point of view. Okay. A last word on Neoplatonism. Remember, you want to understand Kabbalah from Gershom Scholin's perspective, that the Kabbalah is the intersection of Jewish Neoplatonism and Jewish Gnosticism. You have to know what these words mean if you are going to understand Kabbalah. So what is Neoplatonism? Well, Platonism, I'm going to refer to that first version of Platonism, which is we have the mind of God, The mind of God emanates these ideas, let's say love, justice, truth, and beauty. These ideas are communicated down into the conscience, the inner life of human beings. We know them to be real, not in an empirical sense. We can't weigh them, measure them. We don't discover them in the laboratory, but they govern the life of a righteous person. A righteous person wants to be truly loving. A righteous person wants to be truly committed to justice. A righteous person wants to live a beautiful life, preserve beauty in the world. A conscious person wants to be a person of truth and understand how to find truth. So I'm just going to use those limited love, justice, truth, and beauty as it were, emanations that come down. They flow into us. Now, what Neoplatonism understands is, which means there's Platonism, and then what is called middle and neo. I'll just put those two together, where the divine emanates these into us, but through veils, through a system of emanations. And why this would be, we know from a very, very simple observation. There are some people, when they talk about justice, they'll say, well, justice is whatever a group of people happen to think. Well, you and I know that that's not true. We know that people can get it wrong. So if you're to say, well, whatever people do is just, then the word justice has no meaning. You might just say people do what people do. Why add the word justice to it when all it is what people do? So you say to yourself, well, I can watch what people do, but I know it's not fair. I know it's not just. I know it's not holy. I know it's not true. They'll say, well, that's just your opinion. You say, no, it's not just my opinion. My opinion is connected to a higher truth. That opinion is not. Well, then you're elitist. Then I'm an elitist. But I never, by the way, read what people do and say, well, that's the way you do it. This is the way I do it. Who's to know? I'm judgmental when I read it because I know there are different systems of justice, and some are quite horrible and don't produce justice. And there are certain systems of justice that create justice. So you have to, in a way, be unabashed about the idea of moral realism. There are better and worse answers to moral questions. Many people are not unabashed moral realists because it sounds elitist. It doesn't sound humble to say, I know there are better and worse ways. I can't demonstrate it to you empirically. If you're one of those people that says everything is equal, every system of thought is equal to another, no matter how debased, depraved it is, if people think it, it must be true, this is probably not for you. These ideas, now again, you can study these ideas. They won't mean anything deeply to you unless you accept the idea that there are better and worse answers to moral questions. So same thing with questions of love, justice, truth, and beauty. So let's say these are emanating to us from the higher realm, the realm of the divine, but they emanate to us through lenses or through veils. And some people under the last lens or the last veil have no idea that there is a chain of lenses or veils that goes the way all up into the mind of God. They have no conception of that. From their perspective, if I think it, it's real. If I do it, it must be right. Okay, that's the level at which they live. So they're not only are they below the lowest veil or the lowest lens, they don't even know that there are lenses and veils. The next person is the person that says, I know I do what I do. I just don't know if it's right. And I know what other people do. I just don't know if it's right. And I wonder if there's a criterion. Now, the minute they ask that question, they can move beyond the first lens or the first veil, and they have some grasp of knowing that there are better and worse answers to moral questions and how to figure that out. Now, you're never going to persuade the person in the lowest level who doesn't even know there's a veil or a lens. You'll never persuade that person. But we don't need to persuade those people. Meaning once you move up a lens or move up a veil, it's your duty. You're the one that has to act according to the higher lens, the higher veil. So Gnosticism holds that they are metaphorically ruled by lesser gods. They are imposing upon us a distorted reality. And the only way through it is to be the gifted Gnostic who just goes around that system and knows there's a higher realm, but you're stuck in this demonic realm. I think, life under Stalin or Mao or something. Then you're in another realm where it's not that we're blocked from the divine, but that what exists between us and the divine are lenses and veils. Jewish Neoplatonism has the more veiled understanding of reality. Jewish Gnosticism has the more stark dualism of a higher realm and a lower realm. Now, if you look at ancient Jewish Second Temple text, if you look at the Jewish text of the pseudepigrapha that I showed you, some of them are more Neoplatonic, meaning they believe in lenses and veils. Some are more Gnostic, which means there's a stark vault, a stark divider between the higher realm and the lower realm. We inherit both of them throughout the Second Temple period. They percolate into rabbinic Judaism. Now, both of these are rather hidden. You can read the Talmud day and night and really not detect neither Jewish Platonism nor Jewish Gnosticism. However, if you know these terms, you can detect them. You can detect them in the Bible as well. And by the way, what is the most Gnostic text in the Hebrew Bible? Anybody have a guess? Hold your answer for a minute, and I'll take your answers. We definitely have mystical texts. We definitely have texts that have the idea of the layer, but we have one text in particular that has an ongoing Gnostic flavor until the very end, when the barrier is pierced. Okay, so to review all of this, when you move into the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah, you're dealing with a system that has both a Neoplatonic dimension, which is that ultimate reality is veiled, and the Gnostic system, that there's an absolute block between us and the truth. But because both are Jewish, which means we don't live hopelessly and helplessly in the abyss, they both have a way through. So you have Jewish Neoplatonic texts which talk about climbing the ladder, and you have Jewish Gnostic texts that talk about breaking through the wall. Now, just to fast forward a little bit, when you come to the 16th century with Isaac Luria, who has, by the way, Isaac Luria has apparently studied these ancient Gnostic and Neoplatonic texts. When he arrives in Tzfat just a few years before his death, he clearly has a Neoplatonic and Gnostic system worked out. He's worked out a connection of all this with the Kabbalah, arrives in Tzfat, becomes the most well-known teacher as having put this all together. He dies quite suddenly. It takes decades for all his teachings, which were communicated orally, to put into written form. But Isaac Luria is our greatest example of a deep religious philosophic understanding of the Neoplatonic and Gnostic dimension. His texts aren't written down for decades, but it is his texts that create more the Hasidic movement. I would say my religiosity. I call myself a in the Lurianic Hasidic tradition. And by that we mean that there are Lurianic myths, Lurianic poetic understandings of the world that capture rather perfectly the tension between Gnosticism and Neoplatonism. It's Luria's ideas understood by Hasidic rabbis that shape my spiritual psychology, and therefore the spiritual psychology with which I study the Sfirot, this handout that I showed before, okay, as a path to discovery, excavation of the inner life, the repair of the inner life as a path to my own authenticity as a human being and as a path to God. So what I wanted to do was share with you today is I just don't read this and start practicing. I have within me a pretty solid understanding of Jewish Gnosticism, a pretty solid Jewish understanding of Jewish Neoplatonism, something of an understanding of Kabbalah and especially the Lurianic school of the Kabbalah, and a pretty good understanding of Hasidic ideas. That's what I bring to the text. So from my perspective, if you're not bringing something like that to the text, you're just going to open up and start counting the Sfirot. I'm not saying that's a bad idea. That's a good idea. Now, the more Kabbalah you know, the better. There's no amount of Kabbalah that's going to hurt you. It's only going to benefit you. But the more you bring the lens of the intellectual and spiritual background of the Kabbalah, the more this is going to open up for you. So my goal today was to alert you to the Gnostic background, the Neoplatonic background, to understand that if you understand that well, everything that comes next is going to help you break into the deep understanding of the spiritual psychological study of the Kabbalah in particular, in general, the Sfirot in particular, and especially what it means to work your way, use the Sfirot as a contemplative inner life transformational practice.